Good morning, folks. We have been talking about the feminist ethical model before in our previous conversation. We had discussed the notion of an ethics of care. And folks, the reading in your book is by Lindemann. This notion of an ethics of care is largely associated with Nell Noddings. There's not a reading from her in our textbook. Now, and this might be a parallel to virtue ethics. Remember how virtue ethics says, find a moral exemplar who is a paragon of virtue, and take that person as a sort of moral god. That's what was meant by an exemplar. Now, the model for morality for feminist ethics is the care that a loving mother has for her children. We ought to act with the kind of care that a loving mother has for her children. Now, folks, I talked before about the fact that not all women are caring people. This is something that tends to be associated more with women. In part, essentialists would say that women are essentially more caring by men. More caring than men. I don't happen to think that's true. I happen to think it's largely constructed, I will admit. And part of it is because in patriarchal societies, women are more often than not in subservient caregiver type roles. And when you are thrust into those kind of roles, mired in them, it is no wonder that you will begin to have compassion for the vulnerable. Now, an essentialist might also try to tie it in with biology. Obviously, as a male, I cannot have children. My biological connection with my children is not the same as my wife's biological connection with my children. She carried them for a while. She stayed at home for a time period as a primary caregiver. She was mired in it. So understandably, her relationship with her children is slightly different from mine, or perhaps in some cases majorly different. Because of the nature of our economic arrangements in this society, a man is sometimes reduced to being a mere breadwinner. We're kind of told that we're not supposed to be emotional about things. Emotions are supposed to be a bias and a bad thing. Being emotional is also seen as a weakness. And men are never supposed to express their weakness. Even in our quote-unquote, what they call politically correct age, we still have some of those same models for looking at females as well as those same expectations of manhood. And unsurprisingly, most people do what? We tend to conform to those roles whether we want to do so or not. And I guess one of the other problems is societal expectations. We kind of get this false viewpoint that it is the right way to be rather than merely a social construct. But yeah, if you don't do what's expected, you get disciplined and punished. To use that line from the social theorist Foucault, he won't be on the test, but I'll behave a little bit here. Now, I already said before, but I want to reiterate this. Feminist ethics is not talking about throwing out the traditional quote-unquote masculinist theories. In other words, there is value to be found in many of the ethical theories that we've looked at before. The problem is, every ethical theory is limited. The feminist critique is, by completely keeping the emotions out of the equation, we get an incomplete analysis. Because our emotions can sometimes inform us of things that matter. That was something that feminist ethics has in common with virtue ethics, too. Just to reiterate that. Now, I don't think I need to repeat this too much. But what the author meant when he talks about against unification, that's merely to reiterate this idea. Feminist ethics has no singular absolute moral principle. Instead, feminist ethics contends that the care that a loving mother has ought to be something like a guiding principle. And this is another difference between these pluralistic models and prior absolutist normative theories. Pluralistic theories tend to talk about things that can help to guide our moral decision making. Those earlier theories that were absolutist tended to make, no, they didn't tend. They made claims that there was one absolute moral principle. And if you found out how to carry out that principle, then you would have done the moral thing. That's not how these pluralist models work. Instead, they talk about various ideas or models that can help us in our moral decision making. Now, to reiterate this again, abstraction. What I meant was this. The problem with many traditional theories is they tend to tell us that if you want to do a proper kind of moral analysis, you're supposed to pretend like you're not you. You're supposed to pretend like you are an abstract moral agent. And as abstract moral agents, we are identical. So the idea is we should all come to the same what? Yeah, Mr. Dukes is right. We should come to the same conclusions. That's not how the feminist model sees it. The feminist model contends that A, people are not abstractions. Thinking of people as abstractions misses an important part of the picture. Because the fact is, we are in webs of relations. The webs of relations that we are in inform us of what our duties are. To be very blunt, I care about you folks, but my duties to my children are much stronger duties than those that I have to other people. My duties to them are different. Now, the legal system says that, number one. But feminist ethics would say that our intuition that we have special duties to our closest relations is indeed correct. It's not to say that we don't have duties to abstract people, people who we don't know or have relations with. It's just that our duties are different. Our duties are partly defined in terms of our actual relations. Now, the other problem with abstraction is when you start to think of people as mere numbers. In one sense, we say, well, we can look at things impartially so we can figure out the right thing to do. Well, when you look at people as abstractions, it can just as easily lead to us not seeing their humanity. It can just as easily lead to treating people not as people, but as objects. And that's sort of my beef with abstraction. I said before that I love abstract thinking. It's one of the things that attracted me to this discipline. I like to do abstract critical thinking. However, we have to keep in mind, turning things into abstractions can actually lead to the dehumanizing of the other. Abstraction has a potential dark side too. Feminist ethicists, critics are well aware of this. Next. Western societal models tend to place competition on a pedestal. I think I was probably told in the cradle that if we are in ruthless economic competition with one another, the good ideas will succeed, the better people will succeed, and the losers will fall. And we're told that this is the way things ought to be. You've probably heard of the argument for the morality of the capitalist model. It rewards winners and and losers fail, and that's the way things ought to be. No, that's social Darwinism. That's social Darwinism. My politics might be shown. My apologies. Now, feminist ethics isn't saying that competition is always a bad thing. It is actually arguing that cooperation is oftentimes useful. As a matter of fact, whenever we are in relations with people, we should not be in competitive relationships. We ought to be working together. And folks, that's what every meaningful notion, in my opinion, of a society is. We are not abstract individuals. We are parts of communities. Of course, a community is not a family, but a community ought to embody a sort of mutual relation of concern for something like the greater good. We ought to care. Now, I'll move on. Now, folks, this is one place where students oftentimes miss it when it comes to feminist ethics. And this is partly because of the way feminism is portrayed in the popular culture. And the author tries to dispel that distinction at the beginning of the chapter. Liberal feminism, as it's called, often does concern itself largely with improving the rights of women. And by the way, feminist ethics does not disagree that that's an important goal. However, it is not the only goal. Because whenever we emphasize rights, we miss something very important. Guess what rights are? Rights are abstract ideas too. When we frame things in terms of rights, we end up looking at issues in abstract ways, rather than looking at issues in their particularity. When we think only in terms of my rights, and we don't think about perhaps the fact that we have duties to other people, this is where feminist ethics thinks that traditional theories that tend to center around rights tend to miss some important things. Now, some challenges for feminist ethics. Now, the author talks about this, and here's the way I bullet point it. It threatens to limit the scope of our moral concern. Now, this is what the author's talking about. Remember when we did earlier normative theories like utilitarianism and Kant? The moral community literally refers to all human beings. Well, not quite all human beings. For utilitarians, it was any beings that have the potential to suffer. And depending on your utilitarian, you'll remember animals were granted status because they are potential sufferers too. For Kant, it was the community of all rational beings. Now, critics that look at feminist ethics from those angles might say, feminist ethics says that our most important duties are to whom? Anybody? Family. Yeah, family. Those who we actually have actual embodied relationships with. Those are the people who we have duties to. It might threaten the idea that we have duties to people who we don't know. Now, feminist ethics would say they are quite misunderstanding us. We are not saying that people who we don't know don't matter also. They're merely saying that our closest relations, people who we have actual duties to, are those things that ought to take precedence. We would actually all be better off if we had a caring relationship also for people who we did not have actual duties to, as well as people who we don't know. Because the world would be just a lot better place if we would have that same overall attitude for people we don't know too. They're not saying we shouldn't care about people who aren't part of our web of relations. They're merely saying that certain relations take precedence and that they ought to take precedence. And it's also partly because that is the place where we can do the most good. That is the place where we can do the most good. There are a lot of older Americans with a lot of health difficulties who could actually use a little bit of company from time to time. Have you ever been to, visiting a senior residence center? There's a lot of lonely people in those places whose families oftentimes don't want to steal anything from you. This theme here. I mean, a lot of people who are just dumped off. They don't get a whole lot of company and so forth. Now, guess what? You can't go in and visit them all, no matter how much you may want to. Well, maybe you can. We just see to it that those people who are part of our family unit, we at least do our part for them because we care. And it's also one place where we can do some moral good. I also happen to think we kind of have a sort of abstract duty to do it too, but that's perhaps another issue. Now, some critics will also say that the role of the emotions need to be more clearly defined by feminist ethics. The feminist ethicists might rebut, or I should say, might rebut that and say, well, we've kind of defined what the role of the emotions is. An ethics of care is what ought to inform us. Now, of course, that still seems a little bit general and abstract, perhaps. But we're talking about those positive caring relationships. Those are the kind of emotions that ought to guide us. The author also talks about the fact that downgrading impartiality has its costs. What he means by that is something like this. Once you start to think about your own individual duties, you may end up forgetting that we perhaps do have those kind of abstract duties that utilitarianism and Kantianism talked about. Because if we literally only took care of our own sphere, the world may actually not become a better place. As if we limit our scope too much. And that's kind of the fear. Now, number 4 is a point we've discussed in the context of every pluralistic model already. The rejection of any supreme rule makes addressing moral conflicts more difficult. Well, it certainly makes things more complex not to reduce morality to a singular absolute rule. It certainly makes things more complex. But the pluralist would contend the thing is, reality is just that complex. And perhaps trying to reduce morality to one absolute rule might be the wrong-headed point of view. And simply because looking at morality in terms of a guiding principle might not necessarily give you a magic bullet for figuring out what the right thing to do is, it does not mean that it's a wrong-headed approach. Remember, perhaps all we can do is get moral guidance. That might just be the way things are. Now here, I'll read it. It says, while cooperation is excellent, we also need strategies for dealing with the uncooperative. In other words, there will be some difficult people out there who won't care about anyone but themselves. Now, of course, I think in ethics of care would probably say that we should even care about those kind of people, even if we recognize that we're not going to change them. Remember when we did virtue ethics? I made the comment that from a virtue ethics perspective, some people feel sorry for people who lack the virtues. Even if they seem to be completely awful people, some of us have sympathy for people who lack the virtues because we think that they may be missing something central to making living a happy, decent life actually possible. To have an ethics of care is also to recognize that sometimes people are the way they are due to damage. In other words, uncooperative people, or people who don't care about anything but themselves, you don't have to like this, I don't like this, but they are more often than not severely damaged people internally. In other words, perhaps feminist ethics would say we would be better off if we actually had some compassion for those people, even though those kind of people are sure as heck not very compassionate themselves. Now, finally, justice and rights are important. Now, I think I've already answered this question. Feminist ethics doesn't say that justice doesn't matter. It also doesn't say down with rights. As a matter of fact, these things are things that matter too. But caring relations matter too. These things can help to guide us, but so should our web of relations, so should this model of care guide us. Now, for those of you who want a couple of other, I guess, practical ways of looking at things, if you've ever heard someone say, we would probably be better off if there were more women involved in politics than there are. And you'll notice over the last 25 years, more women are getting involved in politics. The problem is, when women first started to get involved in politics, you do know how most of them had to play it. In other words, they had to go about it in masculine ways. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taken seriously. Now, for the people who say that more women ought to get involved in politics, I think from a feminist ethics standpoint, they're talking about something like this. Women's perspectives tend to be different than the perspectives of men. And it is because they tend to have more sympathy for the vulnerable. They tend to relate better to people who have been oppressed, because women institutionally have been oppressed for a very long time, even if things aren't as bad as they used to be. That is, that women would probably actually take the interests of the other more seriously than those coming at issues from a masculinist perspective. Because those coming at issues from a masculinist perspective will turn everyone and everything into abstractions. Will turn everything into abstractions. Now, here's the easy example. Would our leaders be so quick to send people to war, as quick as they are, if they thought to themselves, oh, by the way, these people have loving mothers and fathers who care about them. They are not numbers. These are human beings. Some will come back dead, but all will come back different. But all will come back different. In other words, we would, if we actually thought about these lives as human lives, perhaps we would run our social policy, our social and economic policies differently than we do. If we're talking about things like social programs, instead of looking at people in need as abstract leeches, which I think many people in our system do, if you look at people as people in oftentimes difficult situations who got to where they are due to no fault of their own, rather than looking at people, as as numbers, as abstractions, and so forth. If we were to actually look at individuals with concern, maybe we'd look at a whole lot of issues differently. We're hearing a lot about illegal immigration. Much of the debate is intentionally done to turn these people into an abstract other, so we don't have any compassion for them. They're lawbreakers. They're a bunch of thieves and rapists. In other words, this is not looking at them as human beings. This is an attempt to turn them into abstractions. If you turn people into abstractions, people are not going to be likely to care about them. And the less you care about them, the more likely you will to be willing to throw them on the scrap heap of one sort or another. The more likely you will be to throw them on the scrap heap. But yeah, I just wanted to give you a couple of examples in case the text didn't give you one that satisfied. Now, part of the reason why for feminist ethics, you really can't separate politics from the ethical and the ethical from the politics is because those two spheres are actually intertwined with one another. People lie to themselves if they say that their own ethical commitments do not influence their politics. They're already lying to themselves. Because the fact is, your ethical commitments will almost always line up. That is, if you are a rational and coherent thinker, will line up with your politics. This is why I kind of have real logical problems with people whose claimed ethics and their politics don't line up at all. I happen to think that they might actually be lying to themselves about what their ethics are. Or maybe they just haven't thought about it enough. But yeah, this is why Lindemann argues that they're inseparable. And that they ought not to be inseparable. Because ethics should inform not just our own little sphere, but our extended sphere. Cheers on that.
I have a quick question.
Oh, go for it.